Hello, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to today's webinar. We'll just give it another 10 seconds or 15 seconds for everybody to join us, and then we'll kick off. Thank you. Perfect. It's just gone past 1 minute after 1 p.m. So in the sense of the time, we'll kick off today's webinar. So again, you're very welcome to today's webinar. Today, we will discuss the EU regulations such as the European Union Deforestation Regulation and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, what businesses need to know and do. My name is Ankush Shirsad, and I'm the specialist in the Sustainability Solutions Department of Enterprise Ireland. So please note, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording and the slides available afterwards. The recording will also be available to watch back on the Enterprise Ireland's website in the on-demand section, where you can find our previous webinars from this year and earlier. So we are hosting today's webinar in collaboration with Anthesis Group, and we are joined by Michael Lennon from Anthesis. So welcome, Michael, and thank you for taking time to join us today to discuss the key aspects of CBAM and EUDR regulations. So we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please pop them into the Q&A section and we'll address them in the end. So in 2025, the regulatory environment for sustainability reporting is both expanding and shifting, as many elements are influencing corporate sustainability goals. And embracing sustainability is a strategic business imperative for all businesses. And businesses recognize that sustainability is no longer just a compliance exercise, it's a competitive edge. And then even with the timeline shifting, the regulatory direction is clear. The disclosure requirements are becoming stricter and broader. Now, enhancing the supply chain transparency is a strategic necessity that enables companies to gain a comprehensive understanding of its product's background and the environmental practices of its supplier. So achieving this level of transparency involves a systematic approach to gather and analyze the data on how and where the products are manufactured, the materials used, and the labor conditions under which they're produced, and the environmental policies of your suppliers. So the regulations such as the EU Deforestation Regulation and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism will demand transparency across supply chains and transform how industrial manufacturing and consumer brand companies operate, trade, and plan. So for Irish businesses, these regulations will impose specific obligations that must be met to ensure the compliance and must undergo detailed due diligence and verification process to demonstrate the transparency in the supply chains. So in today's webinar, we'll discuss the key aspects of both regulations and provide guidance on becoming future ready for Irish businesses for both of these regulations. So our speaker for today is Michael Lennon. Michael is an associate director at Anthesis and is a global lead for the firm's CBAM services. Since 2023, Michael and his team have been supporting a growing number of EU importers and non-EU CBAM goods suppliers through a combination of human expertise and purpose-built digital solutions to not only achieve and maintain the regulatory compliance, but also to understand and mitigate the business risk of CBAM's carbon levy. We will also hear from Tim Mollenhauer, who is a senior consultant at Anthesis, and we'll hear from Tim about the EUDR in a short recording as Tim can't join us today. So Tim advises companies on biodiversity risk assessment, nature and no deforestation strategies. Tim has supported multiple companies in EUDR compliance and supply chain assessment from packaging to food and to beverage industry. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Michael, so you can cover our main theme for today.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining today. I'll just get my screen up and shared. I think that should be coming through now. So briefly, for those who haven't heard of Anthesis before, we are a sustainability-only consultancy founded in 2013 with offices around the world, over 1,300 sustainability experts covering every type of regulatory acronym you can imagine, including the one we're here to talk about today, which is CBAM, my personal favorite. So let's jump right into it. So hopefully everyone has a little bit of understanding about CBAM. Fundamentally, it is a carbon pricing mechanism. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And it is really sort of the yin to the yang of the European Union's own domestic carbon pricing strategy or system, the European Emissions Trading Scheme. So to understand CBAM, you really need to understand the ETS. The ETS is the world's largest carbon market. It's a cap and trade system, and it works by obliging target industries to purchase certificates for the emissions that they generate. And so fundamentally, this applies a carbon price to domestic manufacturers across key sectors. But there's a key problem, which is that by applying a carbon price and thereby raising the cost of production for domestic EU production, it disadvantages EU manufacturers with respect to non-EU manufacturers who do not face a carbon price. So in effect, by applying a carbon price domestically, it turns not having a carbon price into a competitive edge, which is, obviously working cross purposes with the climate agenda. So CBAM is meant to close this off and stop what is known as carbon leakage, whereby production moves to places with low or no environmental regulation or carbon pricing. So that's really the key thing to understand, is that this is this CBAM is a two-part. It's the second part of an overall carbon pricing strategy that the EU is applying in recognition that carbon pricing is the most effective way of driving down emissions. And what you can see on the right-hand side here, this chart, is that at the moment, under the ETS, domestic manufacturers affected by the ETS are given free allowances, which means that the majority of their emissions are not subject to the ETS price. So even though the nominal ETS price may be, I haven't checked today, but something like 70 euros a ton, they don't actually pay 70 euros a ton because a lot of the emissions they generate are effectively covered by free allowances, so they don't pay for them. Over time, those free allowances are going to phase out, which means they will pay for an increasing percentage of their emissions, and you can see how that free allowance percentage will phase out from now until 2034. And in correspondence with that, the CBAM emissions, which are subject to carbon pricing, will increase. And so the key thing about CBAM is it has to be equal to the ETS. So those two things have to move in lockstep, which is why you see these two lines sort of moving in equal and opposite direction. So what is CBAM? So CBAM is designed to ensure that select imports from non-EU countries face the same carbon price as those goods which are manufactured in the EU and therefore subject to ETS. And so to see what this looks like in a very simple example, you can see this chart here where I'm imagining that the ETS price is 80 euros a ton. A EU producer, every ton of emissions that they produce would be subject to this price. In a third country, so let's imagine company A is in a country with no CBAM or with no domestic pricing, they will also be subject, the emissions of their product will also be subject to 80 euros a ton. But in the case of company B, which manufactures in a third country with a carbon price of 40 euros a ton, CBAM will only top up that price by 40 euros, such that the net carbon price paid on those emissions is also equal to 80 euros a ton. So the key thing is that CBAM is not a fixed fee. It does not apply the same fixed fee to every imported good. It applies whatever fee is required such that the net carbon price paid is equal to that paid by European producers. Now, currently, CBAM covers 6 key industries. So not all of the industries covered by the ETS are covered by CBAM, but over time and by 2030, all ETS industries are expected to be covered by CBAM. At the moment, cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen are the ones that are covered. And within those industries, only certain product types or good types are covered, and these are identified by specific CN codes or trade codes. So there are two key roles under CBAM. The first is the EU importer, and they are fundamentally responsible for complying with CBAM. They are legally obliged to comply with CBAM. They need to report the emissions of their CBAM goods and ultimately pay the price, the CBAM price for those emissions. Non-EU manufacturers, so their suppliers, the importer suppliers, are required to provide emissions data on the goods that they provide to their EU customers. And those supplier emissions data inform what the importer reports. So the key thing here is that before CBAM, non-EU producers gained an advantage over EU producers when they didn't have a carbon price in place domestically. CBAM flips that around, and instead of making the absence of a carbon price a competitive advantage, it makes decarbonization a competitive advantage. So because all carbon will be charged the same, goods with the lowest carbon impact will be the most affordable, all else being equal. So in terms of where we are on the timeline for CBAM, CBAM has been in place under the transition period for almost 2 years. And over that period, importers have been required to submit quarterly CBAM reports where they're declaring the emissions associated with their imports. And the carbon price has not been in effect, although there is an ongoing risk of non-compliance. So that can be up to 50 euros per misreported or unreported ton. So for EU importers that have not yet reported their CBAM impacts for the previous 2 years, that is a risk to be aware of. From January 1st, 2026, we enter what is known as the definitive period for CBAM, and that is when the carbon price will come into effect. So all CBAM goods imported from 2026 onwards, reporting will be mandatory, and carbon pricing will be paid on the emissions associated with those goods. So this slide kind of shows as simple as possible the basic mechanics. There are two questions to determining. I mentioned that the CBAM price is not a fixed price. It is the price needed to ensure that emissions of imported goods are subject to the same price as the ETS, and that can vary depending on what's already been paid. So there are two key questions that need to be answered in order to report and ultimately pay for the emissions of an imported good. So the first is what are the emissions, the quantity of emissions that need to be paid for, and then what price rate should be applied to those emissions. And so you can see that the basic equation is it's the embedded emissions of the good minus the free allocation, which we've shown in one of the earlier slides. And that tells you how many emissions are subject to a charge. And then what that charge is what is the ETS price minus any price that has already been paid on those emissions prior to import. So that means for both of those bracketed equations, there's a data point which is specific to the product. So the embedded emissions and the price already paid. And then there are these standard values, like universal values, which are the free allocation percentage, which applies to everything, and the ETS carbon price, which applies to everything. So for the purpose of importers, it's getting those product-specific data points that really determines how exposed your imports are, how much you're going to pay for them. So understanding these two impacts or these two data points is really key to understanding your exposure, accurately reporting, and ultimately determining what you will pay for CBAM. So CBAM covers direct emissions, or rather CBAM reporting covers direct emissions and indirect emissions, though direct emissions are the only ones currently subject to carbon pricing. You do have to report both. And the way that emissions data collection works is it's really a cascade of carbon accountability. So the CBAM declarant or the importer must request emissions data from its tier one suppliers of CBAM goods, and they in turn are expected to request the emissions data from their CBAM suppliers, and so on and so forth until the full CBAM system boundary is accounted for. And so you can see that's sort of cascading request and exchange system that is meant to be in place. And the key thing to note is that a tier one supplier may produce a CBAM good, but if their inputs are also CBAM goods, or also known as precursors, then they need to get emissions data on that from the suppliers of those precursors. So that might seem like a lot of work, and it can be. We help a lot of companies with this, and it's certainly a lot to get your head around the first time you do it, especially if you're not doing a lot of this supplier engagement already. Now, there is a way to avoid doing all that work, and that is to use the EU's default emissions values. So these are like standard carbon values that are applied to CBAM goods. But there's a trade-off here. It is less effort, but it comes with higher carbon cost. So it's important to understand this trade-off and determine whether this is the right approach for you. So default values are easy to use. And in fact, it means that an importer can calculate its emissions and report them without any supplier engagement. But default values are intentionally high carbon, which means that they overestimate your emissions, your CBAM emissions, and therefore expose you to higher CBAM costs. So from up until now, default values there's been a single default value per CN code, but from 2026 onwards, there will be country-specific default values. And the country-specific value will basically be these are determined by the EU, and it will be the average national emissions intensity for a given exporting country. So, for example, Turkey, if you're buying a particular CBAM good from Turkey, there will be a national average carbon value for that CBAM good from Turkey, plus an EU markup. And that's the key thing to understand, is there is a percentage increase off the average. Where a country where a average value cannot be determined for a specific exporting country, then it will be assigned the average of the 10 highest emitting export countries for which there is reliable average data. So the key thing is that these default values are intentionally overestimated. And so the pros of using default values is you save time and effort and cost on supplier data collection, and also in using default values, you do not need to get your emissions verified. So you save money on reporting, basically. But the cons are that you overestimate your CBAM emissions, which means you will pay more for those CBAM emissions under CBAM. But critically, you also do not get any actionable insight into the carbon impacts of your supply chain, which means you do not have any information with which to make strategic decisions, like, for example, choosing a lower carbon supplier or determining where you could invest in decarbonization. And furthermore, you have no ability to measure decarbonization as it occurs. So your hands are really tied. It means that you become basically a passive price taker in CBAM. So using default values is likely a better choice if you are a relatively small importer and your CBAM costs are ultimately not significant, then saving money on supplier data collection and so on may be sensible. But if you're importing a relatively large volume of CBAM goods, it is very unlikely that default values are going to be the cheaper option. But each company needs to assess this and decide which path they take. Okay, so just briefly then, in terms of what does compliance look like? So if you're an EU importer, as I imagine most folk on the call here are, you want to do screening to identify which CBAM goods are you actually importing. You need to register with the CBAM registry. So to register as an actual importer of CBAM goods, you need to compile your customs data on an annual basis from 2026 onwards, prior to that quarterly basis. You need to collect emissions data from your supply chain for those CBAM goods unless you're using default emissions data. And then you need to submit your quarterly CBAM reports prior to 2026, and then from 2026 onwards, annual CBAM reports. Okay. Briefly, the CBAM is a live piece of legislation. I actually think it's one of the best examples of a policy that has been trialed and then iterated upon based on feedback and performance over the last 2 years. The transition period has been a really important testing phase, and the EU has been updating the regulations over time. So I don't think I want to go through this in too much detail, but some of the key changes that have been made is previously the threshold for CBAM was anyone importing 150 euros worth of CBAM goods or more was subject to the regulation, which always seemed a bit silly. And the EU has recognized this, and they've changed that threshold to 50 tons. So if you're importing 50 tons of CBAM goods a year, you are subject to CBAM. You must report the emissions for all of those CBAM goods. And that means, if you imported, 30 tons in the first 3 quarters, but then went over up to 50 tons in the last quarter, you have to report for all of those 50 tons. I think the rest I'll leave because I think this will be shared, but some nuances about how this is applied, which you can read about, and these changes have all taken effect. Okay, so let's talk about assessing your CBAM risk, which I think is the most important thing for businesses once you've kind of got your compliance out of the way. The key thing to note here is that CBAM costs will ultimately affect EU importers who are legally responsible for paying for those costs, right? You, as an importer, are obliged to assess the CBAM footprint of your goods, the emissions footprint of your goods, report those to the CBAM authority, and then ultimately pay for them. So the direct cost comes to you, but it affects non-EU suppliers as well because it raises the cost of goods sold in the EU market. And so more carbon intensive third country suppliers are going to see the cost of their goods increase more than lower carbon third country suppliers. So in order to assess your risk, you need to understand firstly, what is your CBAM footprint? So that's emissions by good, by supplier, in total over the year. And then you need to understand what, if any, price, so your effective carbon price, what, if any, price has already been paid on those emissions. So the higher your CBAM footprint, the more you will pay. The lower your effective carbon price, so the lower the less carbon price has been paid prior to import, the higher your costs will be. So with this insight, you can then take a data-driven strategic approach to reducing your CBAM exposure. So really assessing your exposure is the first step to understanding how is CBAM going to affect your business, and then what can you do to bring that impact down. So in terms of assessing your CBAM risk, you really want to map this footprint. As I said, EU importers should already be gathering and reporting their emissions under the transition period, although we know that many are not. We get requests all the time from companies that are just now starting their CBAM reporting. So they are, coming right up to the wire of CBAM taking effect with no idea how CBAM is going to affect their business. Whereas other companies we work with have been measuring this for the last 2 years, and they have a very good idea of how CBAM will impact them and have already been making strategic choices to try and bring that impact down. But at any rate, if you are in this position, you've already been gathering CBAM data, you should know how it's going to affect you. But the data that you're gathering and using to report, while it has all the information you need, the reporting format isn't really designed to allow you to make sense of those emissions. It's designed to support reporting. So you need to take that data that you've got and manipulate it in a way that allows you to really interrogate your CBAM supply chain impacts. You want to look at, which products are driving your CBAM footprint, which suppliers are more or less carbon intensive, and basically start to get a picture of, what are your options. Something we often see is that companies are buying the same input materials or CBAM goods from multiple suppliers, and there can be a really significant difference in footprint between those suppliers. So one of the simplest things you can do is just start shifting your procurement to some of the lower carbon suppliers, and that can reduce your exposure to CBAM. So you've assessed your footprint. That's that first product variable that we talked about in the equation. The second is, what is your effective carbon price? And here you want to understand, what, if any, carbon price is being paid on those goods prior to you receiving them. Now, you will be publishing default carbon price values for countries. So they're going to basically analyze carbon pricing systems in different countries and determine what that effective carbon price is. But you can see how significant and important this can be, because in that chart there, if the EU price, the EU ETS price is 80 pounds per ton of CO2e, and the goods you're receiving have already had a 30 pound per ton carbon price paid in the country of production, then what you actually need to pay is an additional 50 pounds per ton. So that's a significant difference, and there are many countries around the world that already have carbon pricing systems, and they too stand to benefit from CBAM. They will be, all else being equal, more competitive, because those carbon costs are already baked into the cost of their goods. So once you understand what your CBAM carbon footprint is, and what the effective carbon price is, you can start to work out, what is this going to cost me based on the total, the total footprint that you're reporting. And I mentioned how free allocation is going to taper off. Also, the ETS is a market mechanism, so the ETS price is forecast to increase over time as the emissions cap is reduced. And so here you can see an approximate forecast of where the ETS price is expected to go, and thereby where the CBAM price is expected to go. And so in 2026, one could expect to pay something in the order of €2 per ton of CO2 reported, but this will rise very steeply between now and 2034, something like €190 per ton of CO2e. Now, again, this depends on market fluctuations in the ETS, which is not a science. It is very dynamic. So take these with a pinch of salt, but this is a reasonable way to forecast what these prices are going to look like. And the point being is they will rise significantly. So one should not just look at your exposure in 2026 and make decisions on that basis. You really need to forecast costs out to 2034, when free allowances are completely removed and the full ETS price is applied. That's the time scale that you're looking at when you want to start thinking about what actions make sense for your business. Okay, so just to summarize then, assessing CBAM risk. So CBAM costs start low in 2026, but they're going to rise sharply. You want to be thinking about that full timeline. In order to assess your risk, you want to map your footprint. You want to calculate your effective carbon price, and then you want to use those two data points to forecast what is CBAM going to cost your business over time. Once you've done that, you understand the risk that lies ahead of you. You can start thinking about mitigating that risk, which is what we'll talk about for the last few minutes. So when it comes to mitigating your risk, this is really, we're talking about decarbonizing your supply chain, your CBAM supply chain. And there's two sort of key levers that you can pull. So one is about supply chain optimization, and the other is about process decarbonization. So you can see that there's a few actions under each. These are broad brush, but give you an idea of what sorts of actions you might take. We'll go through those in a little bit, but supply chain optimization is probably the easiest one to do, particularly if you're an importer and don't directly control the production process. Although many clients we work with, are importers and import goods from their own operations abroad, in which case they can exercise both of these. But switching to lower carbon suppliers, I mentioned that, the CBAM data you're collecting from your suppliers will show you how they differ in carbon intensity. So switching suppliers is a relatively straightforward choice to make. Looking at how different suppliers might be already paying carbon pricing and therefore maybe less exposed. Their emissions may be less exposed to CBAM top up. So, and then on the production decarbonization side, improving your energy efficiency, adopting lower carbon production methods. We'll explore a couple of these. So when it comes to supplier optimization, I've used the example of metals. A lot of the work we've been doing is in metals. That there's the largest number of companies are by aluminum, iron, and steel. And these charts below just show them there is a huge variation in carbon intensity across these commodities. So both from a country by country perspective, but also a technology perspective. So if we look at steel, for example, there's two primary steel production methods or technologies. There's blast oxygen furnaces and there's electric arc furnaces. The key thing to note is that within both of these technologies, there's a huge range of carbon intensity. So, on average, Indian or Polish blast oxygen furnace steel is more carbon intensive, whereas BOF steel from Canada is some of the lowest carbon intensive globally. So, choosing who you're sourcing from, which country they're located in, and ultimately what their footprint is can really unlock a lot of cost savings and reduce your exposure. Similarly, switching technologies to electric arc furnaces, which are significantly lower carbon than blast oxygen furnaces, can make a huge difference. Aluminum is even more extreme. So aluminum is more carbon intensive in general than steel, but there's an even greater array of carbon intensity available across producers, depending on the carbon intensity of their grid and the efficiency of their process. So the same is true for the other sectors affected by CBAM. So the point being is that there's a lot of opportunity for supply chain optimization, just finding the lowest carbon suppliers and shifting your procurement to them will reduce your CBAM exposure. And you can see sort of the scale of these, how much supply chain optimization can improve the cost that you're paying. So lower carbon suppliers offer major CBAM savings, but also factoring in the effective carbon price already paid by suppliers can also unlock considerable savings. So in scenario one, where we're looking at a different carbon footprint, you can imagine a CBAM good from a supplier with a carbon intensity of 8 tons of CO2e per ton versus one with 2 tons of CO2e per ton. And by 2034, the difference here based on the forecasted prices I shared is 1,100 euros a ton in savings against CBAM costs. So that's a really significant difference. Now, the difference is a little less significant when we think about the presence of effective carbon pricing, but in scenario two, you can see that even where the carbon intensity of the products is the same, if one is already subject to a domestic carbon price in the third country, then that too can ultimately mean that you are paying quite a bit less per imported ton than for the one that is not subject to any carbon price, and therefore you are paying the full ETS price upon imports. Okay, so then there's process decarbonization. And here we're talking about all the different ways that you can reduce the impact of the actual production process. For many importers, this is more a case of working with your suppliers and figuring out what, if any, plans they have to decarbonize. And they have a very big incentive to decarbonize under CBAM because they want to reduce the cost of their goods sold into Europe. One of the most important ones when it comes to the metals sector is increasing the use of carbon-free scrap. Basically, recycled steel and aluminum inputs come with effectively zero embodied carbon impact. So they enter the production process with a zero carbon footprint. And so there is a huge incentive to increase the recycled content of metal CBAM goods. But improved material efficiency is another important one. The way that CBAM works is it accounts for total inputs and total outputs. So the fewer inputs you need to create to meet your output demand, the more material efficient, and ultimately the lower the CBAM impact per unit of output. Fuel switching, electrification, heat capture, lots of options, and of course, different options depending on which industry we're talking about. But this is a really important area to be considering, and also an important area to consider if you are a company that is selling decarbonization or lower carbon manufacturing technologies or solutions. The key thing when you're working out what investments make sense in decarbonization is to think about the marginal abatement cost. And ultimately, that equation is what is it going to cost me to implement it versus what am I going to save? And if that number is ultimately negative, i.e., I am saving money, the avoided CBAM costs are greater than the cost of the decarbonization investment, then that's a really good business decision. So you want to be thinking about marginal abatement costs as you consider what your process decarbonization options are. So then to summarize on mitigating your CBAM risk, so primary production emissions really dominate CBAM footprints and costs can vary considerably. So yes, manufacturing matters, but it's really the primary production, particularly when we're talking about metals. So it's the smelting process. It's, producing that raw steel or raw aluminum to begin with. That's where most of the emissions are wrapped up, and there's a huge variation there to play with. Companies can reduce their CBAM costs by optimizing their supply chains, focusing on suppliers with lower emission intensity or an existing effective carbon price, which is deducted from the CBAM cost that you pay as an importer. But you can also implement decarbonization plans to reduce the carbon intensity of your production. And it's important to think about the overall marginal abatement cost when you're making those investments. So companies across the value chain can gain a significant competitive advantage in European markets if they can demonstrate lower carbon intensity, if they can effectively decarbonize their production. So as I said at the start, it is no longer the case under CBAM that the absence of carbon pricing is a competitive advantage. On the contrary, what is now a competitive advantage is having the lowest carbon footprint for CBAM goods. So just to wrap up then, CBAM costs are going to rise quickly over the next 8 years out to 2034 as free allowances are phased out and the ETS price continues to increase. It is really important that you assess your CBAM risks early to give as much time as possible to understand how your business is exposed and give you the opportunity to start making strategic decisions. However, you can only really do that if you're gathering supply chain emissions data. If you're using default data, you don't really have any of the insights or ability to understand your impacts or measure reduction or target reduction. Accurate emissions and ECP data are therefore essential for risk assessment and mitigation. And optimizing and decarbonizing your supply chain is really key to reducing your CBAM risk, especially with respect to primary production. So businesses that get up to speed on their CBAM reporting, their emissions, and adapt swiftly can gain a real competitive advantage. CBAM represents a major upheaval to these affected industries within the EU market. And understanding your footprint now and reducing it is going to position you for success in the future. And our team is helping businesses all the time with this, both EU importers and non-EU exporters. And we're happy to help anyone who needs it. And lastly, I guess CBAM is not it's starting in the EU, but there are many other countries that are looking at applying CBAM for the exact same reasons. They have domestic carbon pricing policies. They don't want to disadvantage their domestic producers. So don't think that this is, the end of the road. It's really the start of something, and we can expect to see CBAM becoming a much more commonplace policy across global markets.
Perfect.
Right,
Thanks,
I will
Michael.
stop there.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for the information. Lots of insights there. And like we say, we will share those slides. But just in the sense of the time, I'll move on to cover the EUDR regulation bit. So I'll just share my screen and play the recording we have from Tim. But yeah, please put any questions in the chat regarding CBAM for Michael in the meantime.
Hello everyone, happy to give you a brief introduction into the European Deforestation Regulation. I will talk about the content, the scope and objective of the law, also what is defined in the law, who is affected, what are the obligations and requirements according to the law, and what are recent updates around the proposed amendment from last week and how they affect companies and what's the timeline of the law now until the end of this year. And in the end, I will also would like to talk about how Anthesis can support companies in their EUDR compliance journey. So let's start with the objective of the law. Well, the objective is quite clear because the law sets rules to reduce the marketing within the European Union of products linked to deforestation and global forest degradation. But what kind of products? Those are listed in the scope. And first, it targets 7 main raw materials. Those are oil palm, beef cattle, soy, cocoa, wood, coffee, and rubber. It does not only limit itself to those main commodities, but also to their relevant products and derivatives. Here you can see some examples that are listed. For example, for oil palm, the derivative is palm oil. For cocoa, it's chocolate. For wood, it's paper. But there's a full list provided in the law in Annex 1, and you can check it by looking at the relevant HS codes of those derivatives. Now, initially, it was planned that the law enters into force until the end of this year for large and medium companies and smaller companies 6 months later. But now, with the proposed amendment, which got accepted by the Parliament last week, there is a 12-month delay in trialogue. This means that trialogue means that Council, Commission and Parliament will meet again to negotiate on those proposed amendments, such as the 12-month delay. And they will do that in between the 15th and 18th of December. And there they will discuss on those amendments. The amendments do not only limit the entry into force, but some further definitions and simplifications for companies. This means that while all 3 political bodies are agreeing on the simplification and delay, it still has not fully entered into the law's text. And this will be done in the mid of December. Now, what stakeholders are included in the law? Before looking at the stakeholders, we need to talk about what the law actually targets on. And it targets, as said, the introduction to the European market, commercialization, and also exportation of the relevant products which are shown in scope on the slide before, unless all of the following criteria and conditions are met. And those criteria are the 3 ones that are here to the left side on the slide. The first one is that the products need to be deforestation free. This means they have not caused any forest deforestation or degradation in their area of origin since the cutoff date, which is 2020. Forest degradation and deforestation means basically changing the condition of the area towards degradation. So, for example, from a primary forest to agricultural use in this cutoff date, this is a forest degradation. Further, it needs to provide evidence that the products have been produced in compliance with the local legislation of the country of production, and depending on what the stakeholder or company is defined as, a due diligence declaration needs to be submitted to the European Information System platform. Now, let's look at stakeholder definitions. Companies need to decide or define whether they are an operator, a trader, a micro and small primary operator, or a downstream operator. An operator, for example, is a person who places relevant products on the market or exports them. Placing on the market means the first commercialization of the product in scope to the European Union, while exportation means the departure of the relevant product out of the European Union. A trader, on the other side, is a person who solely markets the product, the relevant product that is in scope of the law within the European Union. Now, micro and small primary operators are producers who place products on the market or exports the relevant products, but they are small and micro defined as with the EU law. Next or last is the downstream operator. They are placing products on the market, on the European market, or export the products made from other operators when the products are already covered by a due diligence declaration or due diligence statement. So those last two are parts of the simplification, which is currently in trialogue, as I said before. So they are not finally in the text, but they will be in the mid of December. If we look at penalties of what happens if a product enters the European Union or tries to enter it, but it is not EUDR compliant produced, this mainly includes fines, and those fines can amount to at least 4% of the total annual turnover in the union of the company for the preceding financial year, but it can also include confiscation of the relevant products and temporary exclusions and prohibitions of the company of the European market. It also includes, as a penalty, confiscation of the proceeds from transactions related to the products in questions. Next to penalties, we need to look at what actually needs to happen in the European Union. And here you can see how simple the law is really. And let me take you through some examples based on oil palm, packaging, and timber and cattle as well. For example, if you look at the left, you can see that there are relevant products that are in scope of the law imported into the EU, and those are oil palm, packaging products, and timber, raw timber. And those materials are transported to the European Union to operators which are manufacturing those products and creating from timber, creating packaging materials such as pallets, and traders who are just selling the packaging, for example, to relevant operators, and the oil palm, which is transformed from oil palm to palm oil by an operator, then sent to a trader who is sending the product to another operator who's transforming it to acid, who is then sending it to a last manufacturer who's transforming it to varnish. But why is this last one not an operator? Because they are transforming acid to varnish. And while acid is a relevant derivative of oil palm, varnish isn't. And this is what needs to be checked within Annex 1 through those HS codes. So you need to make sure that you completely understand your supply chain, and then first start looking at the scope. So what products are in scope of the law, what relevant HS codes are in the law, and then look at where are you linked in the supply chain. Are you an operator? Are you a primary operator? Or are you a trader? Because while the operators need to fulfill the full EUDR compliance journey, such as providing the due diligence declaration, submitting it to the traces platform, setting up a due diligence system, the traders need to solely collect information and provide it to the relevant customers. What does this mean in detail? If we look at the due diligence obligations for companies or operators, they really need to fulfill three major phases. The first one is the collection of data and information according to Article 9. What data needs to be collected is the product name, the quantity, country of production, but especially the geolocation of the plot of land where the product originated from. And geolocation means if the area where it's originating from is less than 4 hectares, only coordinates need to be provided, so lat and longitude. But if it's more than 4 hectares, a polygon needs to be provided, so an area, a shapefile. And also, the date of production needs to be sent and collected, and the supplier of the product, the buyer of the product, and especially information on deforestation-free production and legal production. These data needs to be collected by the operator, and then a risk assessment needs to be performed. And this risk assessment, basically, the phase 2 decides whether there's a negligible risk of deforestation and forest degradation or non-negligible risk. And this risk assessment includes relevant indicators that need to be assessed, such as presence of forests as a whole and in some part of the country of production, risk situation and comparative assessment, but also focusing on some human rights aspects such as presence of indigenous peoples, but also situation of the country in corruption, lack of law enforcement. And then risk is rated from 1 to 5, and high risk suppliers, they go into the third phase where risk reduction needs to be included. And if risk can be reduced and mitigated, the products can be placed on the European market. If not, they are prohibited to enter the European market or to be traded or to exported. In the end, all this information needs to be summarized through the due diligence declaration. The due diligence declaration only includes the company name, the HS code of the relevant product, the scientific name and quantity, the country of production, and the geolocations of all the production areas and some assumption of responsibility. And this needs to be filed to the European information system. In the end, Anthesis is here to support on EUDR compliance. And we do that for multiple companies with 2 main steps. The first one is always the analysis of exposure. So we're looking at the company and the relevant products that are in scope, mostly looking at the HS codes. And then we're looking at if the company is an operator or a trader or now primary or downstream operator. And this can be different for one company because we always setting up relevant use cases for those companies, as you've seen in this simplified graph. And one company can be an operator or a trader depending on where they are in the supply chain. Based on that, we're creating an action plan, which includes a gap assessment on actions that needs to be done and actions that are relevant for the company. In here, we're not only focusing on the due diligence system, but also want to make sure that we create a narrative framing in creating out of this compliance journey something positive that the company can communicate to their customers by saying or stating that they are ready for EUDR compliance. Step 2 is ensuring minimal viable compliance. So setting up and defining the due diligence system, piloting and systematization of the due diligence system. And we are also providing an engagement program with key suppliers for the European Deforestation Regulation. So this is how Anthesis can support you as a company in EUDR compliance. And we are happy to do so. Please feel free to reach out to us if you need some support. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Hopefully that gave you a quick overview of both of these regulations. Now, while the EUDR focuses on the land use and traceability, we heard from Michael that the CBAM tackles the emissions embedded in the trade. So basically, I just wanted to highlight just check if we have any questions there, Michael. In regards to CBAM there.
Yeah, I believe there's one about CBAM, about a product that enters the EU through Brazil. Possibly this is a CBAM question. It's hard to tell, actually. It could be either or. I'm going to assume it's a CBAM question. So if a product enters the EU from a third country, maybe something is done to it, and then it's shipped outside to a third country for subsequent processing, and then comes back into the EU, for example, in Ireland. How does that reporting work? So you do not fundamentally, like when the product is entered the EU from Brazil that first time, there's a CBAM reporting process, and the emissions associated with that good are paid for. It then leaves the EU. Any activity that is done in the UK, any additional emissions that arise prior to it being re-imported to the EU, those do need to be accounted for and reported and paid for, assuming the good is still a CBAM good. But you do not need to pay again for the impacts that occurred in Brazil. Those have already been paid for. And you don't need to report them either. So your precursor is a European product and therefore not subject to CBAM reporting or CBAM pricing. I think the key thing here is that, and you can go, there's a link there to the annexes of the regulation where you can see what the CN codes are that are covered by CBAM, but these are basically simple processed or simple finished goods. So think about sheet metal, not car doors, right? So car doors imported to the EU are not covered by CBAM, but sheet metal imported to the EU and subsequently made into car doors, those are covered by CBAM. And one of the key things that the EU will be monitoring over the next few years is whether there's an inadvertent or unintentional leakage to more complex products being produced outside the EU, in which case they will expand the boundary of CBAM to cover more complex products like car doors, for instance. So hopefully that answers that question.
No, absolutely. And look, you also highlighted the link in your second slide for the CN codes, and also in Tim's presentation, he mentioned the HS code for those product categories. So if any company on the call not sure of those product categories, the regulations apply to them, please check those Annex 1 for both regulations. And if these questions are related to EUDR, then we'll definitely run these questions by Tim and get you the answers. So if you have any further questions about EUDR, please email them to us at green@enterprise-ireland.com, and then we'll get back to you on the specific questions. So just one more question from me then, Michael. Just how do you think companies on the calls turn these regulations into resilience?
Yeah, well, like I said, this is a really disruptive force for European markets. For instance, I mean, China produces more steel than the rest of the world combined, but it is also one of the most carbon-intensive producers. It is going to be affected more by CBAM than others. And that is disruptive. So China is investing heavily in decarbonization in advance of this. They're also looking at implementing an export carbon price on goods exported to the EU in order to retain the revenue that would otherwise be collected by the EU, which is another interesting aspect of CBAM. But companies that find themselves as low carbon producers, whether they're in the EU, right? So CBAM is meant to support domestic producers as well, right? So domestic producers in the EU have been subject to some form of ETS pricing, albeit with free allocation for a long time. They are further down the track of decarbonization than many other countries. So their goods will become more competitive. Similarly, low carbon countries outside the EU will become more competitive. And for Irish companies, the faster you move to understand your risk and reorient your supply chain around a CBAM future, the more competitive your products will be against companies that are lagging behind in understanding and adapting to CBAM.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. I'll just share my screen to just go through a couple of slides on the Enterprise Ireland support. So hopefully that's there. Okay, so No, that's great. Thank you so much. I suppose just first to thank Michael and team for today's discussion. And before we wrap up for today, a quick reminder on the Enterprise Ireland supports to companies looking to develop sustainability strategies in line with the European standards and regulation. So Green Transition Fund is by Enterprise Ireland supports companies every step of their decarbonization journey, from the initial planning and capability building to capital investment in decarbonization, research, and innovation. So, the Climate Planning Fund for Business is a mix of consultancy and training supports, helping companies implement sustainable practices and processes. So businesses seeking any supports or guidance to develop that initial sustainability, circular economy, or even biodiversity action plan can use the Climate Action Voucher or Green Start under Access Advice for guidance on developing the ESG strategy in line with EU or international framework, or establishing baseline emissions. Or we heard today how important that is for your products also. So if you're looking to quantify the product as well as organizational carbon footprint, or to carry out circular gap assessment or life cycle analysis of your products and processes, you can also use the Green Start for guidance on that. And companies can also use our strategic consultancy support to develop the carbon reduction roadmap in the bigger scheme of things. So companies seeking training to build high-level environmental management capabilities can use Green Plus, so external training on developing and implementing the ESG strategy or high-level environmental management standards like of the ISO ones for environmental management system or energy. Companies can use Green Plus to achieve training on that. We're also helping businesses access funding to take bigger steps in carbon reduction and green innovation. So businesses can access funding under the energy monitoring and tracking to put systems in place which can help them monitor, track the business use, energy, water, and gas use. Capital investment supports are also there for companies to support the decarbonization of your manufacturing combustion processes. Businesses can also access number of research and development and innovation support from innovation vouchers to large-scale R&D supports under the sustainability, but also our existing research grants. So just on the next slide, I just want to remind you the capability building training programs initiated by Enterprise Ireland, such as the Sustainable Kickstarter Workshop and the Sustainability Leaders Program. So dates for those are on our website, where you can reach out to the green inbox to know more about those capability training programs. And we've covered many topics this year in terms of our sustainable enterprise webinar series. So those are all on our Enterprise Ireland's website in the on-demand section. And we will come next year, we will visit different topics on sustainability. So do join us for those also. So thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon. And thank you to Michael and Anthesis for today. Thank you. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Thank you.